This is Thomas Scholes, and welcome to the first episode of InfiniteSketch. The main goal of these videos is to compress the fundamentals of a method into an efficient time frame. No more many-hour-long tutorials left unfinished. 30 minutes to listen and learn, and the rest of your day to put it into practice. A longer format version and a fully layered PSD are included so that you can slow down and see every detail. If you need to take a closer look in the longer format, just match the time in the bottom right to make things easy. I've also included a link to the Q&A section of my Discord server. Once there, you can ask me any questions you might have about the video, and I'll be happy to help. This first video focuses on the QuickKit method. Because this method recycles existing work, it's a great way to get great results quickly and to learn to use kits without having to juggle so much at once. I'm going to be using just one personal painting that I wanted to explore further, but you can definitely use multiple paintings or dead-end sketches, or professionally, often I'll use some of the initial sketches that have gone through the feedback and approval process and will use this method as an opportunity to incorporate feedback while iterating quickly. With this first video, you should be able to start creating quick kits of your own and learn how to identify any weaknesses or blind spots by testing them with a quick sketch. Episode 2 will focus on using what you've learned to evolve this kit into an even more interesting and useful second generation. This is my first narrated video, so please let me know if you have any feedback or spot any issues. Thanks in advance. All right, we're wasting time. Let's jump in. Okay, so first step here is to remove some of the mood created by kind of this purple key. Luckily, that was done via layers in my image, as well as characters are on layers too. So I'm going to remove those as well so that I have my background in a neutral color range that will allow us greater versatility in how we can use this in the future. And taking the characters off will allow for easy selections. Okay, now we're ready to make a new document. You'll want it about the same size as your original, but with a little bit extra room. And I like a square format because it's kind of static and it helps you not worry about composition. For some of these initial selections, I'm just going to use the polygonal lasso tool because a lot of what I want here is rectangular, straight edged. But you can switch in between polygonal and just the normal lasso tool by holding down Alt, which is very useful for getting some of the detail out of these shapes. For some of the shapes that are going to be much more complicated, I'm going to use the Quick Select tool that you can see here. And it's a great time saver, even though it can be a little bit messy. But I think you can relax a bit about that. We're going to pull out a lot of pieces here that we're not sure if we're going to use them yet. So it's not really worth your time to polish them and have an absolute perfect selection. And on top of that, sometimes you'll pick up some pieces that you didn't intend to that can become sort of happy accidents or can contribute in ways that maybe you didn't expect. So I'm going to continue just grabbing everything that is interesting, whether it's going to be used more as an object itself or a texture, whatever catches my eye. And I'm treating my new document as sort of a sketchbook page where I want to fill the page. I want to fill in little gaps, and there's a bit of a composition going on. I can sort of play off of some of the other shapes and get an idea for, if I have too many medium-sized shapes, maybe I need something larger, maybe I need something smaller, and can kind of fill in the blanks that way. In addition to the most interesting pieces, make sure to include some that are less interesting, some that can be sort of filler pieces or rest areas for all this texture. Keep an eye out also for tiny little pieces that have visual interest but may not be considered to be an object or a texture by themselves. These will come in handy to modify some of your larger pieces, break up spaces, break up symmetry, as well as enhance your color palette. Okay, I think that covers most of the basics, so I'm going to speed way up here. If you're visually sensitive or epileptic, you might want to turn away and just listen to the audio. I'm keeping all these pieces in perspective as well as the QuickKit document in perspective, we can always flatten it out layer as necessary in the illustration or as the kit evolves. Because again, we're still not quite sure which of these pieces are going to be the most useful, and we don't want to waste time right now in transforming each and every one of them. It is essential, however, to leave plenty of room around each piece so that you can quickly lasso and copy the kit into your new document. Make sure also to leave each piece on its own layer in case you need to move it around later. Once finished, however, I would definitely recommend flattening your document because we're copying these in high resolution and these files can become quite massive. Total time here is pretty quick at about 22 minutes in real time. This is a great task to do as warm up or cool down or in those spare moments just before meals or meetings. Often it's a task that I leave to the end of the day, not just because I'm tired and don't have a lot of energy to think, but it's also a great way to motivate yourself to get to work the next day to see what you can do with it. Okay, slowing back down here in just a second because we're finished and going to start in on the illustration. This new document will be about the same size as the original that we created the kit from. I'm often working at about 8,000 by 4,000 pixels because that fits my monitor perfectly at a 25% resolution, so it's an accurate representation of what the image looks like at 100%, and it runs well on my machine, but you should find out what works for you and your monitor. I've grabbed a few quick pieces to help establish my perspective and horizon line, and at this point I'm going to create my guide for 1 point perspective. I'm going to start with the horizon line and then just use transform and transform again to create a radial guide. I think there's probably a lot of other, maybe even better methods out there, but this one's quick and it works for me. I've placed my guides into a folder marked P for perspective, and I have an action set up to show and hide that folder. And I really recommend that you set that up for yourself because if a tool is hard to use, you're less likely to use it. I'm not going to cover actions here, but if you have a hard time setting this up, feel free to hit me up on Discord and I'll help you out. Our main goal at the moment is to test the kit that we've just made. We don't need to make a great illustration here. We just need to see what pieces of the kit have the most potential, as well as identify any weak spots or missing parts of the kit. I'm hoping right now to create a keystone or cornerstone part of the painting that is interesting enough to serve as catalyst for the rest. I think at this stage it's actually important to not have a goal in mind, to not have a finished illustration in mind, and instead revert back to what I think of as kind of the ultimate form of learning, which is play. To just like with Legos or maybe building blocks, to start to build something and react to it, see what you can do with it, get inspired by what's possible rather than having to force something into your expectations. Even professionally, I try to make as much time as I can for this stage because I find it helps me avoid the cliche and provide the client with something truly unique and interesting. And more so, it helps me find something that I find truly unique and interesting, which keeps me motivated even on some of the tougher jobs. Overall, I also find that the fewer variables that you have to juggle, the more focused your efforts can be. Professionally, you might be in those first stages of collaboration where you're trying to synchronize with what is in someone else's mind and depict it visually. You may also still be trying to work out some of the basics of a concept, whether it's style, palette, or materials. And I've found that the simpler you can keep things, the clearer the communication will be and the faster progress will be. So it's a definite slow and steady wins the race situation. And there's a traditional portrait artist saying that comes to mind that it's the worst thing in the world to paint the perfect eye only to find out that it's in the wrong place. And professionally, you might find that you're turning in a final and your client will say, "This is perfect, but we forgot to tell you that stone is inappropriate for this culture, or there's no wood in this type of environment. So we need to take exactly what you have, but remove some of these core elements." And work that has to be modified at that late stage is never as high a quality, nor is it much fun to try and force it into a new direction. Outside of professional art, whether you're creating something for your own fulfillment or to study a new technique, I strongly recommend having this stage of play that will allow you to engage your instincts and to strengthen your artistic instincts, as well as have less to juggle so that you can focus on just learning the method itself. I'm still just exploring here and testing out different pieces, keeping everything as flexible as possible, moving it here or there, seeing if it clicks into place and starts to create a scene that I want to explore. And I'm really not looking for any sort of guarantee that this is going to work out. I want to spend at least, 20, 30 minutes without worrying about that. If after that period it's still not working out or I find myself getting bored or frustrated, it's usually time to either start over, work on something else, or take a break. In the beginning, more often than not, I'm selecting pieces from the kit that look like they have the most potential, and I'll try to just explore how it could be used. Sometimes, and especially later on, I'll select a piece for a specific spot, but if it doesn't work out, I'll still try and find a home for it. I think it's important not to let your expectations dictate your process. It's important to be open to possibilities you haven't preconsidered. I know for a fact that my best work comes from a process of discovery rather than creation. To help me concentrate, I most often have either music or audiobooks or podcasts on while I work. For some of the initial stages, or if I'm doing a lot of problem solving, I think music or sometimes just silence works best. If the day's tasks are repetitive or require more of my instincts than my intellect, that's when I rely more on podcasts or audiobooks. I tested this door piece earlier, but wasn't quite ready for it. I felt like it was too soon for a focal point, but after exploring further and getting a greater sense of what the scene could be, I felt it needed the focal point in order to start focusing on the composition. You've probably also noticed by now that I'm mirroring the canvas in order to check the composition and my shape design. And that's also on a hotkey, as well as flipping my layer is on the hotkey just next to it. And again, I strongly recommend hotkeys because, one more time, if a tool's hard to use, you won't use it. If I find a piece works well somewhere, I will try and use it again somewhere else in the painting. This tests its potential further, but it also creates a rhythm in the scene that allows your eye and your mind to explore the patterns in a composition. Generally, I'll be working on whatever bothers me the most or wherever the biggest issue is. And this allows me to work as efficiently as possible. Once the big issues are taken care of, I'll move on to smaller and smaller issues until they're just not worth the investment of time in order to make the painting, 1% better, 2% better. Why waste that time for 1 or 2% when I could do another painting that can expand the concept, show it from a different angle or another part of the world, or iterate upon it towards a different direction or based off of feedback? In a similar light, sometimes I'll experiment and find something that works, but I'll know that it will require a greater investment of time than it's worth. And I'll have to make that hard choice to focus on the greatest potential from the least amount of effort for the greatest payout. I'm using levels to change the value of a lot of these pieces as necessary to create a composition or have it blend with existing pieces. Levels, I think, is much more useful in this circumstance than hue saturation because the bottom part of levels allows you to adjust value just as you would in hue saturation. And because I'm not too concerned with color at this point, I don't need the other options. And by adjusting the midpoint or the highlight or shadow points, you can have much greater control over a material. I'm at the point now where the core of the architecture concept is in place, and I want to add a character for scale and to act as avatar for the viewer. It'll also serve as additional visual interest and psychological contrast of organic versus inorganic. I'm not that interested in character art or characters or even character narrative, to be honest. I'm definitely an environment artist through and through. So I usually will do a big batch of characters maybe once a year, and I have those in a file that I can use and reuse, saving me a lot of time and agony. With the character in place, I'm now going to try and anchor the composition with some elements of detail. I'll be creating some areas of high frequency versus more rest areas. I'll be using different colors, different shapes to create secondary focal points or supporting areas of interest. A lot of this is similar to what I would do with manual rendering, but very different visually, and often I'm surprised with what I'd find. Again, it's a process of discovery rather than creation, of taste rather than thought. And at this point, I'm fairly satisfied with the environment and the character and the composition, and I'm going to focus now on the background. In the past, I might use just a simple sky or render some clouds, but lately I've really been enjoying the depth you can get out of reusing a previous illustration. The perspective doesn't always match up. Sometimes you get lucky. Sometimes you're just going to use some elements or pieces or the palette to get that background started. I'm going to test the shapes and the structures first to make sure that it's a good fit. There's plenty you can do later on to change the values or the color palette in order to make it match your scene. And I think some of my first attempts are working just fine, but I'm going to test a lot more very quickly just to explore some different potentials of subject matter and color palette. I've decided on this city scene to be reused for the background because of the incredible amount of depth that it gave and that the architecture fit the scene and even the perspective did as well. With everything kind of in place at this point, I'm less concerned with the structure and the concept and am starting to work on the value pattern and legibility or readability of the scene. And I'm mostly checking to make sure that nothing's too distracting, that I'm creating paths that lead the eye into and around the scene. The background and composition at this point, I think, are working pretty well. And what's concerning me the most is that it doesn't quite feel lived in or once lived in. It doesn't feel like a city. There's not enough going on that says anything outside of the architecture itself and the materials. And a lot of that, will be developed as this project continues. But for right now, I'm going to borrow from generic sort of prop kits that I have had from the past. Okay, let's speed up again real quick. In addition to enriching the setting, these props will also help create some additional focal points and areas of interest. Some of these props I've had for close to a decade and have been using ever since. And I think it not only saves time, but creates a really interesting cohesion throughout my work through repetition year after year. And though none of these props would be that difficult to create again or from scratch, I really enjoy the difference in mindset of basically decorating a set, finding the right home for something that you already have really agrees with a mentality of not just efficiency, but conservation. Whether that's the client's budget or your energy or your motivation, I think it's essential to invest wisely. Okay, so I've created a bit of a triangular flow between some of these props that is stable but interesting enough that I'm ready to move on to other issues. I'm not going to take the time for direct lighting or cast shadows, but I do want the scene to have as readable of depth and as interesting value design as possible. There is a general direction to the light, but it's still diffuse enough everywhere else that I can avoid any labor intensive rendering. And I'm still thinking of this as a concept sketch less than a full illustration. So that amount of labor or time and energy isn't really worth it in my mind. I'm working with big shapes first, creating contrast between light and dark areas, and using selections to work quickly and softly, because I don't want to add more noise from brushwork in these areas. Similarly, I'm using a selection to create a levels adjustment layer to adjust values and value ranges without adding further detail. For smaller and already high frequency detail areas, I will switch to the brush, not only because it's going to be quicker, but these areas can handle additional noise or detail without altering the composition too much. And eventually, this focuses on smaller and smaller areas and rendering some ambient occlusion and outlining other areas for clarity. I think the composition is in pretty good shape at this point, and I would want to push the color range just a bit further. I'm not looking for a dramatic mood for this first illustration, just to add a bit more variety. With that in mind, I'm going to run through the color editing tools on adjustment layers and just see what I can do. With each tool, I'll rely on my taste to guide me, and will double check myself by clicking the layer on and off throughout the entire process. Make sure and look at the included PSD for a closer look at each of these edits. Sometimes an edit might improve the values but weaken the hues or saturation. If this is the case, you can put that layer on luminosity only mode, and vice versa for hue or saturation, or there's even a color mode if both are working but values aren't. I think the palette is working a bit better now, and what's most important to me at this point is to add more interest to the scene. After a focus on more abstract interest or just visual interest, I think that adding a second character, though grouped with the first, will create a more complex focal point and a rhythm within it, and should also imply some passive narrative. Just a quick solution that doesn't cost me much more time or energy to add a lot more interest. Satisfied with that, you'll see me moving on to smaller and smaller readability and value pattern issues as I speed the video back up. I'm cropping the image now because I'm confident that I won't need to move any major pieces or background layers any further. It's also important to do this since everything out of bounds of my canvas is greatly increasing my file size, as well as the amount of memory the document needs. And at this point, the document's running slower than I'd like. I'm also cropping it because though the composition was working, there was something about the space that felt off, maybe too cramped. And cropping it will make it a lot easier for me to make this next adjustment. There's a great tool in Photoshop called Content Aware Scale that allows you to selectively scale an image. By default, it seems to leave areas of detail alone and scale mostly areas of rest. That means textured areas won't scale as much as untextured areas. It can automatically detect figures in photography, but with illustrations, I found it's necessary to create an alpha layer to make sure your figure's proportions stay intact. To do this, make a selection of your figures and click on the Channels tab. At the bottom of the tab, click Create New Channel. Now, when you activate Content Aware Scale, you can select your alpha from the drop-down menu at the top of the screen. This is another thing that if you have trouble with, let me know in Discord and I'll be happy to help you out. So at this point, really the only major thing that is missing is probably a chicken. So make sure you have a chicken on your template, though a duck will do in a pinch. When working with kits, especially, there can be a bit of an unpleasant skew or distortion to the scene just due to how it was constructed. And the liquify tool is a good and quick way to correct the worst of it. Generally, it's best to leave this to last since it requires you to flatten or compress your image onto a single layer. You'll see me click that layer on and off to see if the changes that I made by instinct hold up to scrutiny. If there are some parts that aren't working, I will create a quick mask on that layer and selectively pick and choose. Quick masks are great because they're non-destructive. You can go back and forth between adding and removing as much as you want. There are a lot of other tools I'm using in this video that I'm not able to cover in this video or won't be able to cover in detail. I hope to do an episode in the near future focused solely on tools, and it would be helpful to hear from you if you have any questions or are curious about what you're seeing. So please let me know. The final stages are really just an ever smaller spiral of all that we've done so far. Minor adjustments, retesting palettes, pushing the values here and there. I know I am done or should be done when at this final stage, 20 minutes is spent and the image has either not improved or gotten worse. It wasn't too long ago that I was much more of a perfectionist, that each image needed to be pushed as far as it possibly could. I do think there is some benefit from doing so occasionally, but there's a very real danger of burnout from this mentality. It still feels a bit odd to say this, but I think 80% finished is better than 110%. Leaving that 20% buffer makes sure that you have the energy and motivation for revisions, iterations, or to better weather the cancellation of the task altogether. Again, slow and steady wins the race, so please be strategic about your energy, pace yourself, and invest wisely. To help keep myself from overworking an image, I try and have multiple images in progress at a time. The urge to invest in detail and ever diminishing returns is much easier to resist when there's another image that can benefit much more from the same amount of time. I highly recommend joining in on any of the many monthly challenges that require daily results. I think this is some of the best practice against perfectionism you'll ever get, and I guarantee you'll learn a lot about your habits. That said, deadlines, both real and artificial, definitely help, but come with their own stresses and complications. So try not to put too much pressure on yourself. If you're not enjoying it, you probably won't do it and you won't get any better at it. Again, I really do believe that the ultimate form of learning is play. I'm using the threshold tool here to grab a selection, copy, and then blur it onto a screen layer in order to create a bloom effect. The threshold tool is also a great way to check your value pattern and the legibility of an image. Okay, some closing thoughts. This kit isn't too bad. There's plenty of interesting shapes of all sizes, great bits for detail, and an okay amount of color variety. Much like sketching with a pencil, here it's not so much about the final results and much more about finding the concept or learning the method. This quick sketch isn't too different than the original that the kit was built from, but it does contribute additional information and design to the existing concept as well as iterate upon it. In hindsight, I do think more variety outside of straight lines and rectangles and probably more rest area pieces would have been better for the kit. Overall, I'm happy with this as an example for demonstration and as practice, especially perspective practice for myself. When demonstrating, I definitely don't take as many risks or experiment quite as much for the sake of clarity. And part of the problem was that this kit was created from just one sample image in order to keep this tutorial as simple as possible. So I want to make sure and mention that it's a great idea to mix a few similar images together for a kit with greater diversity. Likewise, it's a great idea to mix different kits in when creating a new image. When creating kits, I especially enjoy sampling from dead end or stalled out sketches. Conservation and motivation is vital to every artist, whether working professional or beginning student. So it's great to be able to recoup as much spent energy as you can and turn it into new work and new progress. I'm sure you have a hard drive or closet full of sketches with loads of lost potential just waiting to be remembered. So go gather them up and get busy. Again, hit me up on Discord if you have questions about the techniques in this video. In episode 2, I'll be taking this kit further and we'll focus on some enjoyable methods of doing more with what you already have. Okay, that's it. I'd like to thank my cat and my neighbor with noisy power tools for reminding me to take a lot of breaks.